Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing the second card in my Compartmental Christmas card making series. This one has a mixed media vibe and uses a variety of mediums including inks, sprays, and paste. As always, I've got loads of tips and tricks to share with you and ideas on how you can compartmentally create or mass produce this card. If you're interested in any of the products I'm sharing in this video, you can find links to them in the description box below. Just click on more to see more. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I really appreciate that so very much. For this video, I'm going to be working with a variety of stamps and stencils and dies. You, of course, feel free to use similar supplies from your stash if you're going to follow along. The stencil I'm going to be working with is the Sparkle Fade stencil by Tim Holtz. I'm also going to be working with the Holiday Vault Classic die set, and I'll be using this for part of the sentiment on my card. And then I'm going to be working with the Winter Woodlands stamp set, and then I'll be using the Tiny Text Christmas stamp for part of my sentiment as well. And then I'm also going to be using the coordinating die set that goes with the Winter Woodlands, and this is available only at Simon Says Stamp. And as always, I've got all the supplies linked down in the description box below, so if you're interested in any of them, you can click on the links there and check them out. And when you shop through those links, you are supporting me, so I really appreciate that so very much. Some of the mediums I'm going to be working with is Distress ink. I've got iced spruce, pine needles, and ground espresso. You could certainly use Distress oxide inks for this card as well. And I'm also going to be using some of the Distress Spritz and weathered wood. You could use similar color or the Distress mica stains if you'd like as well. And then I'm also going to be using Grit Paste Opaque. And the papers I'm going to be working with, if you remember from the letterboard card that we created, I recommended cutting out that frame piece from the center of a piece of cardstock. And here I'm going to be using that leftover paper as part of the background for my card. I'm also going to be using some Distress watercolor cardstock, and then I've got a piece of kind of a light gold metallic cardstock. This is the craft stock, so it has the craft paper that has a printed metallic finish to it. And I also recommend some other kind of white cardstock that you can just do stamping on, and save the Distress watercolor cardstock for the background panel because of the various mediums we're going to be using. So I've got my watercolor cardstock cut down to 5 1/8 by 3 7/8. And I just wanted to create a smaller layer because I'm going to create some other layers to go behind this using the metallic cardstock and that wood grain paper. So the first thing we're going to do is take the Distress ink and Ice Spruce, and we're just going to do some ink smushing on the background. And if you want to use oxide inks for this, you certainly could. You could also just spray the paper with spray stains if you want, or you could even ink blend it if you would prefer that as well. Just kind of like the look of the ink smushing. Once you smush the paper into the ink, then if you've got a little bit of excess ink, you can kind of tap that off, and then just use your heat tool to dry the paper. And if you wanted to make this darker, you could certainly repeat the ink smushing and just add another layer of color once you've dried that first layer, because when you dry in between the layers, you're going to build up those layers of color, and you'll also create a little more interest in the design that it will create as those inks kind of layer on top of each other. But I just wanted a light wash of color. So now we're going to do some of the stamping, and I'm going to be taking that, I'm not sure what to call this image, but it kind of looks like a guide to various types of evergreens. And I'm going to position my paper here in my stamping platform, and I'm just going to use a little bit of temporary adhesive to just kind of help hold that in place here. And then I'm just going to line up my stamp with where I want it to stamp onto the background here. And then I can use my magnet to kind of help hold that in place a little bit more if need be. And now I'm going to take that same ink color that I used for the ink smishing, and we're going to kind of create a tone-on-tone effect here. And again, if you wanted to use the oxide ink with this, you certainly could. And then we're just going to stamp that onto the paper here. And I'm going to give it another layer of ink. Since we're stamping with a dye ink, specifically Distress ink, which is a little more fluid than other inks and a little more water reactive, and we're stamping onto watercolor paper, sometimes you might need to stamp it a couple times to get that good impression. And then I'm going to dry this real quick just so I don't smear anything. And just take a second for that ink to dry. And the heat tool is just nice to help kind of speed up that process. You could also just let it air dry if you wanted. And then I'm going to clean off my stamp just so I don't accidentally get ink anywhere where I don't want it. And now I'm going to kind of line it back up so I can stamp more of that image onto this background here and fill up the whole paper. And we're just going to ink that up again just put some ink along this edge here. Ink that up one more time. And there we go. And then we can dry this layer as well. And then while we've got all of our stamping stuff out here, I'm just going to go ahead and stamp the tree image. And I'm just stamping this onto a piece of white heavy stock. But any kind of white cardstock will work. And for this one, I'm going to use that pine needles. And I picked this color just to have a little bit of contrast to the background since I'm going so kind of monochromatic with things. But it kind of stays in that same color family and gives you a nice effect here. There you go. So if you feel like you need to stamp that again, go right ahead. I feel like that's got a pretty good impression there with that. That just kind of shows as well how the ink kind of soaks into this craft stock compared to the watercolor paper where we had to stamp twice to get a more crisp and darker image. And this stamped a lot easier, and that's just the nature of paper. So just goes to show, in my mind, how different papers are good for different things. So then with this, I'm going to take that coordinating die and cut out the tree, but you could also fussy cut this as well. So that's just kind of up to you. All right, so now we're going to go back to the background here, and now I'm going to add some of that Distress Spritz. And again, I'm just using weathered wood. And if you're new to the Spritz, one thing you want to make sure is that this has a pigment in it that kind of settles on the bottom of the bottles. And you want to make sure before you start spraying with it that you get all of that mixed in. So there's a little rattle ball in there, shaker ball, and you just want to shake this until you get all of that mixed in, and then you can no longer see all that settled on the bottom here. So I'm just going to shake that up real well. And you want to just keep shaking until there's no more of that kind of powdered mica down there on the bottom at all. So like now it's all mixed in really nicely. You kind of roll it around and there's just a little bit of fluid there, but there's not all that mica kind of packed down on there on the bottom. It's all mixed in with the fluid. And that, by doing that, that'll help keep these from clogging, because these can clog pretty easily. And that's just the nature of any kind of a spray that's got that mica powder in there to create that shimmer and shine. So having it mixed in can kind of greatly reduce the likelihood of that. So now I'm going to take my splat box here, and I'm just going to give a few spritzes of this across the paper. And I like to kind of go a little bit slow and get some of those little splatters, and this tends to kind of spray that way naturally. That's part of the way it was designed. Tim wanted it to give you that kind of speckledy, fleckledy look. And then, as you can see from here, really doesn't look like much, just, you know, add a little bit of color. To really get this to shimmer and shine, it has to be dry. And if you get some of these bigger droplets of it, those can take quite a bit of time to dry. So I really recommend either using your heat tool to speed up the heating process, which is what I'll be doing, or making sure you give this plenty of time to dry, because until that's completely 100% dry, that can kind of rub off onto your hands. But once it's dry, and I've not had any issues when I dry it with my heat tool of that rubbing off at all. Here's a look at this now that the spritz is dry, and you can really see that shimmer and shine that you get from the spritz. And as I said, now that it's dry, you know, none of this is smearing or rubbing off on my hands. Anything that might be showing up at all on there is from just me handling it to begin with. But yeah, now we're ready to move on to the next step. All right, so now we're going to be adding some texture using the Grit Paste Opaque and the stencil here. And for those of you that maybe have taken my Distress Paste class, I'll have a link to that in the description box below if you're interested in it. But there's really a good reason why I picked the Grit Paste Opaque, and that's because it does not tend to absorb the colors of the ink underneath it like the regular texture paste opaque would. And in that class that I mentioned, I go into a lot of detail about all of these different distress pastes. So if it's something that you're interested in and would like to learn more about, I highly recommend that class. Yeah, so let's add this here. So I've got my palette knife and got my stencil here, and I'm just going to get this positioned. I'm kind of playing around with where I want to get that design on my background, and I'm not looking to put stencil pattern all over the whole background. I'm going to put a little bit kind of up in this corner here. Just kind of not looking for like a perfect coverage or anything. And then I'm just going to gently peel that up. Get a little more paste on my palette knife here, and then I'm going to kind of position this down on the over across this lower corner here. Kind of repeat that same process. And I kind of like to tell people, when you're putting on the paste, kind of think about it like buttering your toast. You don't press it down flat. You can put a little bit down just to kind of get it started, but you're not pressing it. And then you're kind of holding that palette knife at an angle as you pull that paste across the paper. And then you just want to make sure that you don't have so much on here that you can't still see the stencil. So if you've got so much on here that you can't see the stencil, you've got way too much paste, and you need to kind of scrape off that excess, and then you can put that back into the jar, especially with this paste. Now, if you are using regular texture paste to do this, it's not going to be nearly as white here, and if you really look closely, you're going to have picked up some of that color from your background, and so I would not put that back into the jar if you're using regular texture paste. You know, once the paste is applied here, you're just going to set this to the side and let it dry, and then make sure you either get your stencil into some water so that you can wash it later, or wash it immediately right now. Off camera, I did my die cutting. I've got the tree die cut, and then I've got my sentiment pieces, and I cut it once from that gold craft stock, and then 3 more times from some craft stock. And I'm going to glue all these layers together just to give this a little more stability, because this die is really very delicate and detailed. And then that also will add a little bit of dimension when I adhere it onto the front of the card. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of sandpaper. This is a Ranger sanding disc. It's just a fine grit sandpaper like what you could get at a hardware store. And I'm going to very gently kind of sand some of the edges of this metallic paper. And this only works with paper that has a different core to it. So if your metallic, or if your gold paper that you're using is gold on both sides, it may or may not be a different color on the inside. Kind of the way to find out is to do the sanding, or sometimes you can, if you tear the paper, you can kind of see those fibers and what color it might be on the inside. And I'm just gonna, like I said, just kind of removing some of that metallic finish, just so I can give it a little bit of a distressed effect. Now this is definitely a step you could skip during the process of making this card. And it's kind of a matter of personal preference on like how much of this you want to do. And then you can just wipe off that dust. And then I'm going to take a blending tool and some ground espresso ink, and I'm just going to kind of ink over this and kind of get that ink. Then we'll kind of fill in where I removed that metallic, and just gives it a really nice kind of a distressed effect. And again, you can kind of do as little or as much of that as you like. And so there you can kind of see the effect you're getting here on the edges. So if you want more of that, just keep sanding and add more of that to make it even more grungy and distressed. And while we have all this out, you can do that same thing to the other piece of metallic cardstock. And this I've got cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm going to be layering this onto that wood grain paper that we used from earlier. And as you can see, I did the same thing here where I cut out the sentiment piece from the center here, just so I'm not wasting paper. And you could actually cut another one out of it on this other side, maybe even just for use on another card. Just saves a little paper. And then we're just going to sand the edges of this one, just like I did that die cut sentiment piece. And we're going to do the same thing here with adding that ink to the edges. And again, the more you sand off and remove, the more of the brown ink that's going to show for that distressed grunge effect. And then you can just take a, kind of dampen a little rag, and then just use that to kind of wipe off that any excess ink that might be on that cardstock, because it's not really going to dry on this metallic paper, because it's not the finish on there, it's not going to soak into the paper. And the other thing we can do, we've got the ink out. I'm just going to ink the edge of my little sentiment strip here. I just stamped that in ground espresso archival ink just to coordinate with the card here. And then I'm going to just kind of add a little ink blending with that same ground espresso around the edges of my tree here. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add some ink to this, and I'm going to use that pine needles as well, because like when you're doing the layering, you kind of think about all these pieces here. You could certainly leave it white, that would be really pretty, and just maybe ink the edges with the same ground espresso that you did here. But I'm going to ink that with this pine needles just to kind of help that color pop a little bit more. And you can go as light or as dark with this as you like. Here I'm just using a little blending brush. You can also use the foam brush as well. I just kind of grabbed this one because it was handy. And you don't really need to do into the center here at all because that's all going to get covered up with those other layers of cardstock. And then I'm just going to kind of ink the edge of this with a little bit of that ground espresso as well. To kind of give that a little more of a distressed look. So here is a look at that dried paste. And as you can see, it pretty much kept its white appearance, which again is part of the nature of this particular paste. It's going to kind of maintain that opaque white look because it doesn't really absorb the inks as well. And then to finish this off, I'm just going to add some ground espresso around the edges here. And so there is a look at the finished background. So when it comes to the compartmental making for this card, if you ended up making that letterboard card that I shared in my first video in this series, you'll have these backgrounds, but if not, you can just go ahead and cut these. If you don't want to use a wood grain paper, you could just use solid paper. You could use solid cardstock. You could just use white cardstock. You could emboss it with an embossing folder if you want a wood grain effect, or you could just use solid colored cardstock. And so, so that's one thing that you could do all of those, and then you could cut all of these pieces and sand the edges and then ink them. And then you could do your die cutting for this piece. You could do all the stamping for this piece. You could do, and then do all the die cutting. You could do all the stamping and the trimming out and inking of the sentiment piece. So, just kind of take one component of the card and kind of focus on that and get that done, and then you can move on to the next. And then the same thing with the background. Maybe you cut all the background, so maybe you cut all your papers at the same time. But you could cut your background paper, and then you could do the ink smushing, and then you could do the stamping, and then you could do the texture paste, and then you could do the inking around the edges. So just lots of ways to kind of break it up so that you're not having to sit down and do all of it all at one time. And then, once you have all your various components finished, then it's just a matter of adhering them to the card with whatever type of adhesive you like. And, if you want a little more dimension, using some foam adhesive is always an option as well. Here's a look at the finished card with its layers of texture and shimmer and shine. I hope you enjoyed the second video in my Compartmental Christmas card making series. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.